Grace and peace to all you resonating lights, you wonderful beings who are awakening to who you truly are and following us on our journey as each and every one of us, including those that speak, are discovering more and more about who we are. It's a great mystery, and it's definitely one worth your life and your lifetime to pursue. We hope that each and every one of you had a wonderful Christmas season with your family and celebrated and opened all the gifts and ate all the delicious food that you're going to have to work off at the beginning of 2024. But we did pray for each and every one of you. We missed you all as we took off Christmas Eve to have time with our families and do what we needed to do. Family always comes first. That's the first institution that God set up on the earth. He gave Eve to Adam and told them to be fruitful and multiply. That is our first duty here on this earth, because through that union, God creates more space to put more of Himself in this life and in this Word. That's why biology matters. That's why these teaching matters, is because we're given an opportunity in this life to be able to produce a temple for God to reside in every opportunity that we have in this life. And that's echoed from the very beginning of what we learn from the Old Testament in Genesis, and that is also true for the creation myths throughout the world and throughout civilizations. Speaking of Genesis, we're going to begin today, or tonight, in Genesis 3. And in Genesis 3, there was a whisper. And that whisper occurred in a garden. And it was directed towards a woman. Now, the King Jimmy, which we all know and love and appreciate for all that it's done, would translate this Hebrew word nakash as serpent. But when you really look into the original translations, the original Hebrew that's being used, we see that nakash means a whisper of a magic spell. Now, that magic spell can be associated with what John talks about in John chapter 1 as the Logos. It's a whisper of a word. It's a whisper of an enchantment. It's a magic spell about a future prophecy, a future foretelling of things to come. See, because in the beginning when all things were created, Adam and Eve weren't where they needed to be for God to do what God needed to do. There was going to be an evolution. There was going to be a process and a change. There was going to be an understanding that they get to and they reach through these inevitable impasses with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, by verse 5 in chapter 3, we realize that this whisper is an enchantment delivered by the divine enchanter. And it's to reveal to the first of us, the first human beings that existed, that became conscious that they were more than just mammals. I'm not telling you to take Genesis literally that the first two human beings were Adam and Eve. We know that through basic biology and some of the theories of Darwinism and other things like that, that other human beings have existed and have existed for somewhere near 100,000 years. So when we take that into consideration, we've forgotten much about who we are. We know very little. Our memory, our records, our ability to go back and retrace those steps from where civilization truly began, where community really began, where human beings really differentiated themselves in the animal kingdom began. We don't really know when that happened, but we kind of have an idea of how that happened. And Genesis lays that out. Symbolically and through these metaphors, we begin to understand that at some point, our mammal beings, our divine beings were put inside of this mammal body, and that mammal body had to wake up and realize that it just wasn't an animal in the animal kingdom, that it was something much, much more. So it's the first of us that were ready for our eyes to be opened, or more precisely, to become conscious of our true connection to the sacred and our godlike potential for good and evil. You see, I bring this word nakash up because out of the 11 occurrences of this word, only here in the garden is it translated as a serpent. Now, I believe there's a good reason for that, considering the writing and the reflecting that took place during the Hebrews' captivity in Babylon, which just so happens to be home to the creation mythos, the Enuma Elish, which we've discussed before, that tells of Marduk, the hero and the chief god, who defeats the elder goddess, Tiamat, who's symbolically seen as a dragon or a serpent of chaos. And Marduk does this to bring order and become the Lord of gods of heaven and earth. The significance of this mythos in context is that Marduk is considered the wisest of the wise. His magic words or enchantments are characterized as both creative and destructive in power, via or by way of the transformative capacity of fire. He's a sun god, meaning he is assimilated to sight, vision, illumination, enlightenment. It's these magic words or the speaking of fire, and we know that from the King James Version, as the tongue of the Lord comes out like a two-edged sword, flaming and ready to do what it's purposed to do. These are portrayed as the most powerful weapons in the battle against the forces of chaos. So Marduk gathers his weapons, a bow, a club, and lightning. He sets himself ablaze and makes a net to enclose Tiamat. He is a master of his armaments, which is to say he's competent with the tools or the technology that serves to fundamentally transform the unknown and terrifying world into the comforting, productive, and familiar. He binds the unknown, limits its sphere of action, and brings it under subjection. He splits Tiamat into pieces and creates the world with it. Now, Jeremiah 23:29 reads, "Is not my word like a fire, says the Lord, and like a hammer that breaks the rocks into pieces?" I bring up these similarities because God has revealed himself to more than just the Hebrew people in more ways than we can imagine. This mythos is tied directly to our understanding of what the Hebrews thought of as God and wielding the power of God. The understanding that God was giving to them, this is what I am capable of, so are you. Jeremiah would also say that restraining even the mention of God or the speaking of his name would cause his heart to become a burning fire shut up in his bones, where he could not endure such restraint. But before we get too much deeper into mythos, let's get back to the whisper of a divine enchantment. These were identified during a message, and I began this message some time ago. The bishop gave me a list of the whispering wisdoms that's found. And it's just beautiful to go through. And I want to take the time to go through that because when we're talking about this whisper, when we're making the distinction that what we're talking about in the garden with the woman is not a serpent, but it's a whisper of a divine enchantment. It's a whisper from the above. It's a whisper from God. Let's see what those other whispers look like when they're properly talked about. In Psalm 16, verse 7, it reads, "The way you counsel me makes me praise you for more. For your whispers in the night give me wisdom, showing me what to do next." Psalm 19, verse 2, "Each day gushes out its message to the next, night by night, whispering its knowledge to all." Which that tells us that nature itself is speaking to us and giving us knowledge, each and every one of us, for our own interpretation, for our own edification. Psalm 55, verses 1 through 3 reads, and this is from the Message translation, "Open your ears, God, to my prayer. Don't pretend you don't hear me knocking. Come close and whisper your answer. I really need you. I shudder at the mean voice, quail before the evil eye, as they pile on the guilt, stockpiling angry slander. The whisper of God quiets all of the noise, all of the things of this world, all of the things in this life that burden you, that trouble you, that make you afraid. Just a whisper is all we need. Proverbs 6, verse 22 reads, their wisdom will guide you wherever you go and keep you from bringing harm to yourself. Their instruction will whisper to you at every sunrise and direct you through a brand new day. Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 13 reads, can you not discern this new day of destiny breaking forth around you? The early signs of my purposes and plans are bursting forth. The budding vines of new life are now blooming everywhere. The fragrance of their flowers whispers, there is change in the air. Arise, my love, my beautiful companion, and run with me to the higher place, for now is the time to arise and come away with me. This sounds exactly like what God was intending for those two human beings, that man and that woman who we call Adam and Eve, in that garden. Finally, Isaiah 41 verse 13 reads, I am Yahweh, your mighty God. I grip your right hand and won't let you go. I whisper to you, don't be afraid. I am here to help you. If these are the things that God is whispering, if these are the whispers that the men of prominence, King David, King Solomon, Isaiah, the prophet, are saying about the whisper of God, how wrong have we gotten the translation in Genesis 3? It had to be intentional. It wasn't something that they did that was wrong. It makes the tree of knowledge of good and evil an inevitable impasse. They had to come to that place. They had to reach that point where their conscience, which is born in, alerts them, hey, this whisper I'm hearing, it rings true to me. Something in that woman said, I trust what's being said to me. That little voice in my head is saying, this is a good thing. I should do this. So much so that she takes of the fruit and she eats of it. And when her eyes are open, she goes straightway to find the man. And there's his conscience at play, which when he hears the words of the woman who's already eaten of the fruit and he sees that she hasn't died, something inside his conscience says, this is a good thing. I should do this. And they do. You see, to live a life where our actions are marked with the notion that God exists and draw as closely to a godlike existence in this life is what we call alignment with the sacred. An alignment where, like in Psalm 37, verses 23 and 24, God sees us as good and delights in ordering our steps into the divine intent He has for us. The divine spark God placed within us, and the divine potential for now demonstrated by our very lives and existence in this time and place. The Stoics would call this theoides. To reach a place where to be merely human is to deny the divine, quote, chip off the old block that we are. It is this very cultivation of the divine within us that gives meaning to being human. Plato would say it like this in his dialogue of Theaetetus: the best way of life is to be as godlike as possible. Marcus Aurelius, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, would say it like this in his Meditations: remember how long you have been putting these things off, and how often you have received an opportunity from the gods or from God and have not made use of it. By now you ought to realize what cosmos you're a part of and what divine administrator you owe your existence to. And to that end, to your time here has been marked. And if you do not use this time for clearing the clouds of your mind, it will be gone, and so will you. Our time is very precious in this life, and we need to use it wisely. In his meditations, he referred to the Logos as more than just mere reason. He used it to mean the principle which orders all things in the cosmos, which is what we believe God is. Meaning that it signifies both the form and the context of what's being said. Logos, then, employed by the individual, employed by one of us, is what the mind uses in order to make a right decision. How, then, can the mind use the Logos if it's not conscious of choice? Again, I'm pointing you back to Genesis 3 and making the argument that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was an inevitable reality that we had to choose to involve ourselves in. We had to choose to engage with this reality as more than an animal, more than a mammal, but something else. And what is that something else? Well, that's the mystery we're here to talk to you all about. Genesis 2, verse 25 reads, "And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed." It points out something here, and I think this is significant in what we've been talking about, is in our natural state of nakedness, we only see children comfortable in that state. Only my son, who's 2 years old, about to be 3, is completely comfortable spending his entire day buck naked, playing in sand, tackling the dog, eating his peanut butter and jelly, walking around with snacks, belly poking out, butt poking out, stuff all on display. And in his natural state, he thinks nothing of it. He doesn't think for a moment, I'm so ashamed. Look at my body. You can see my private parts. This is awful. This is terrible. He's at peace. He's at rest. The noise and the comparisons of this life in this world haven't caught up to his consciousness. He's not aware yet of what the status quo is, of what the norm is. He's just being himself, and he's being more of his true self than what he'll eventually become when he realizes, oh, I can't walk around like this in the house. I can't be this comfortable in the body that God gave me. Now, I'm not advocating for any nudist camps or vacations or nudist beaches. I have to put out a disclaimer when I make comments like this because you never know what's going to happen in the comment stream. But at the same time, there is something to be said about the mindset of individuals who can be comfortable in the body that God gave them and not feel shame in living that way. Now, of course, there are inappropriate things and there are negative things and there are negative aspects, but isn't that true of all things in this life? Any good thing can be used for an evil purpose. We see it every day. We deal with it every day. I deal with it every day in the criminal justice system. There are good people that make bad choices. There are good people who take good things and do bad things with them. It's a part of life. So am I condemning anyone that feels free and comfortable to go to an appropriate place and bear all? Absolutely not. No judgment. Will you catch me there? Absolutely not. Not a chance. But my son at home with family where he feels safe, where he feels trusted, in a place that he was put into by us, in his walled garden of existence, he's free. And it's a beautiful thing. Genesis 3, verse 1. And we're going to read through Genesis 3. I talked about it a little bit in the introduction, but we'll go through it just so that everybody knows what we're talking about. And I've added in the translation to reflect what I believe, is the true intent of these words. If you choose to believe them or not, that is entirely up to you. Now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field, or, to be read like this, now the divine enchanter, the whisper of God, was more prudent than any living thing of the field which the Lord God had made. Now to me, if we're talking about the creator of all life, if we're talking about the one who'll never leave you, never forsake you, be with you always, even into the end of the age, the one who has never established a place of eternal torment and damnation for any one of His children. And in the event you choose a life that separates you from the goodness of God, all you have to do is ask to be freed from that place of existence, and God will come and get you because He's been with you the whole time. To me, the second way I read that makes more sense. So I'll read it again. Now the divine enchantment, the whisper of God, was more prudent than any living thing of the field which the Lord God had made. And He said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said to the whispering enchantment, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, in the middle, in the very center of it all. The wheel within the wheel is how it's been talked about in church for many years. Or His will in the middle of your will is how I would say it, like Ezekiel said it. Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. Now, the order of temptation is always the same. The tempter sets in motion the divine temptation within for a deeper understanding of who they are and what their purpose is. So God here is tempting the woman with what she needs. Just like Job was tested for what he needed, who he needed to become. It was a transformative situation. God was negotiating for you to change. Tempted for the good of God, for the will of God. It's humanity that hopes to avoid material consequences in this life, fearing death, hell, and the grave. It's the divine being within that hopes to subdue humanity, not to avoid material consequences, but to confront and overcome them, to manifest the truest forms of life, heaven, and resurrection. Jesus is our example of how we accomplished this. Because I say it in the past tense because it's already done. Jesus already ransomed us. The divine does not fear the material consequence because the divine isn't limited by the material world. We talked about this, the limitation principle of God. The temptation or the test is to adventure into the unknown, to become conscious of who you are and what all you're capable of. It's an awakening to what lives within and transcends the material world. Verse 4. And the serpent said unto the woman, Let's try that again. And the serpent said unto the woman, or the divine enchantment spoken to the woman, Ye shall surely not die, for God doth know that in the day you eat thereof, then your eyes will be opened, and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, so first she sees it, and that voice in her conscience, her mammal brain says, this is good to eat. There's nothing wrong with this. And that it was pleasant to the eyes, which means it had an allure. There was something hearkening to her when she saw it. It's like when I walk into a steakhouse and I see a fresh prime rib walking through, it's still got steam coming off of, about medium rare. My mouth begins to water. That's what I want to go eat. That looks like good food. That's pleasure to my eyes. Ty agrees. He's probably going to go get him one after this. And a tree to be desired to make one wise. So she sees the opportunity to become wise. So she took the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons, which can also be translated as a belt or armor. Now, that is where I'm headed with the title of this message, this lesson. We're purposed to be a warrior in a garden. The first thing Adam and Eve make when they're awakened to who they truly are is a form of armor. And that's significant. Let's find out why. And they heard, which from the Hebrew is shama, meaning to hear intelligently. So they didn't just hear God in the cool of the day for the first time. They understood who showed up in the cool of the day for the first time. This isn't just a pleasant, refreshing feeling in this voice that comes and visits all of the animal kingdom. There is something about this being coming here that's different now. There's something inside of me that knows and recognizes the difference. I'm hearing, but not as an animal. I'm hearing intelligently as a divine being for the first time. That is significant. The first action is to put on armor. The first thing you hear is the difference in who shows up. It's not just a wind rustling through, cooling the day anymore. It's God Himself. And which means being demonstrative of an entity, properly the self. So I'm hearing intelligently, and that's demonstrative of recognizing an entity has arrived. The voice of the Lord God walking or whirling from halak in the garden, in the cool or wind, ruach of the day. Now this whirling and this wind becomes a being and a voice. You're hearing it intelligently for the first time. So what do these human beings do? They hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees of the garden. You see, with their eyes open to their own divine potential for good and evil, an inner mutiny begins to take place. I believe that humanity sees an opportunity to seize the power inherent in their own potential, and divinity sees an opportunity to serve with competency inherent in their potential. The part of you that identifies with this material world is protecting its vulnerabilities by fashioning and adorning armor and trying to blend in. The inner mutiny must be contended with voluntarily, which ushers in struggle and suffering, because we were designed to stand out from the rest of the animal kingdom, from the rest of all creation. This demands reliance on God. It demands that you pay attention, listen, and you hear intelligently the sacred's whispers. A whisper, so you draw close. You're slow to speak and equipped for your next steps towards your intended purpose. It's your life. You choose how you live it and whether it resembles more of heaven or more of hell. That's how serious this awakening is and the reality that comes with it. Before this eye-opening moment, Adam and Eve were merely gardeners, and they're now faced with a war within that will eventually become a war without amongst all people. An old Chinese proverb would say this: it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war. Contending with the proclivities born in you, in your darkness and humanity, requires you to be a warrior. Jordan Peterson would say it requires you to be a monster. because you have monsters within you to contend with. And you need to be victorious. Not to slay the monsters, but to embody that monster for the time and the place, if and when, if ever, it's necessary. There are situations and things that occur in this life that are uncomfortable and unfortunate. And sometimes it requires us to be a monster to get through them. A warrior is a nicer way of putting it, so we'll stick with that term. But it is better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war, because contending with these things requires it. You must be trained to mastery with the weapons of warfare and contend with darkness to have dominion. To be competent enough to have dominion and not misuse it. To this point, Marcus Aurelius would say, a man's worth is no greater than his ambitions. Nothing happens to any man that he's not formed by nature to bear. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it. 2 Corinthians 10:4 would say it like this. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the material world, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. See, the armaments adorned by Adam and Eve were ineffective to overcome their fears and protect them from the material consequences of their conscious awakening. Gardeners make armor out of plants. They would need to learn to put on the whole armor of God, made for them to wear and do battle in. They're not getting hand-me-down armor. This isn't Saul's armor on David. This is the armor of God that David wore to slay the giant. This is the armor they would have to learn to procure. This is the armor they would have to learn to put on and wear. Like when Marduk, that we talked about earlier, he had mastered and put on all his armaments, meaning he was adorned as a competent warrior. The dragon of chaos, seeing this, would become afraid, much like the dragons of our chaos. The monsters within become afraid when we adorn ourselves with the full armor of God to confront them. They're the ones afraid because they know the outcome, because you and I are God's. That's something to believe in. That requires faith to say. It requires even more faith to believe. That's what the whisper in the garden was awakening us to realize and actuate in ourselves. So chaos would be put on notice that we are coming in prepared to extract habitable order, to abide in complete alignment with the power of competence with the sacred. Inner mutiny presents strongholds our physical bodies cannot adequately contend with. And that reveals the reality and existence of God and our need for God to overcome. 2 Corinthians 3:5, not that we are competent in ourselves to claim anything comes from us, but our competence comes from God. As I was studying out this material, I had been wanting to watch a movie for a while. It was one of my favorite movies when I was a late teenager, which is some time ago. We won't talk about it. But it's a Ridley Scott film, and it stars Russell Crowe, and it's called The Gladiator. And when I was doing this research, I was reading so much of meditations and so much of Stoicism. I was listening to a lot of Ryan Holiday from the Daily Stoic. And he is excellent, by the way. If you're looking for resource material on Stoicism, on Marcus Aurelius, on background, on some of these great, great thinkers, he is absolutely fantastic and worth your time to listen to, and he's entertaining to listen to. And I'd seen him first in a podcast with Joe Rogan, and he began talking about the movie, and that's what sparked the interest to rewatch it. I'm studying this out, and it pops up on one of my apps on my TV as a recommended movie for me that night, randomly out of the blue. So I said, this happens to A.J. Moses a lot, so I'm going to see what happens. So I began to watch the movie. And of course, the movie is set off initially, the Romans are at war with the Germanic tribes, and they're expanding their empire under the rule and reign of Marcus Aurelius. Now, he was a co-emperor, which the movie doesn't talk about, with Lucius Ferrus. That was his stepbrother. There's a lot of history. I could nerd out on this for a long time. To break it down like this, a lot of emperors, if they did not have sons, would adopt a son, and they would name that son as the next emperor. Marcus Aurelius was seen, and I'm trying to remember the emperor's name. It begins with an H. I know that. Herodotus or something like that. I don't want to butcher it. That's wrong. I said that out loud, and that's wrong. His name will probably come back to me, but he had seen something in Marcus. He didn't have any sons, and he had seen something in Marcus as a child. And Marcus's nickname was the Truthful One. And so he adopts Marcus into his family. And he has, through the weird genealogy, the emperor at the time has the opportunity to name Marcus as emperor, but he's too young. So he has a brother or a brother-in-law, someone close in the family that's of the right age. He names him as the co-emperor, and that was, it was his stepbrother, his stepbrother, through all of this adoption, mix match, bring other, children into the family to keep things going on. He inherits through that process a stepbrother, and as a stepbrother, that's a natural rival. We're talking about a time where, you would assassinate your own sibling to take over a throne potentially. So Marcus has an opportunity, or the emperor has an opportunity to name his stepbrother as a co-emperor and allow him to rule until Marcus comes of age, and then he can be named co-emperor. One of the conditions was, if I name you co-emperor, you have to adopt Marcus as your own. So Marcus is adopted again by the co-emperor Antoninus. He adopts Marcus. The idea of the emperor was that Antoninus would probably live 5 years. Well, he wound up living for 19. So Marcus wound up having this 20-year apprenticeship to become emperor of Rome, which plays into a lot of who he is and how he is. The movie is great. It has some things that are wrong with it. Commodus is actually underplayed as a psychopath in the movie. He is much, much worse in real life, and actually winds up destroying much of what his father built with his reign and rule over Rome. He did not kill his father, as the movie portrays. He was actually sent away by his father. Marcus Aurelius died from the plague. He sent his son away so that he wouldn't catch it. But he did know that his son should not be emperor. He did know he didn't possess the cardinal virtues that the Stoics believed were important, which is temperance, wisdom, among others, courage, and fortitude. So when you talk about those cardinal virtues, he knew that his son had none of them. But he still named him the heir as opposed to the movie. Maximus in the movie, the main character, Russell Crowe, the great guy, he doesn't exist in history. So he is a fictional character that Ridley Scott came up with to kind of display a little bit more of a story. But I say all that to say this. I've given you kind of the historical rundown. I've butchered it a little bit, so forgive me for that. But the movie starts out there at war with the Germanic tribes. And Russell Crowe's character is the general. It's Maximus. They were victorious in the battle, and there's a scene, and the scene had stuck out to me as a child or as a young person as super important, and I just thought it was a meaningful and a touching scene. And honestly, from it, I took the idea and the notion that this guy didn't want to be the king. And to be fair, growing up as a preacher's kid, I didn't want to be the top guy in church either. I didn't want to be heir apparent to anything. I wanted to do my own thing. I wanted to have my own story, so to speak. And I related to that aspect of it, but that was the only part. And if I can, if you all are with me enough to go with this, I'd like to read the back and forth between the movie Maximus and movie Marcus Aurelius and kind of lay this out in a way that makes sense for what we're talking about today. So Caesar Marcus Aurelius, he sends out for Maximus, and Maximus comes in. He says, well, you sent for me, Caesar. And Maximus turns to look at the weakened and older Marcus Aurelius because he doesn't respond, and he asks again for Caesar. Marcus Aurelius or Caesar says, tell me again, Maximus, why are we here? And Maximus responds, for the glory of the empire, sire. And Marcus responds, he says, yes, I remember. You see that map? And he points to a map of the expanded kingdom that he has in his tent. That is the world which I created. For 25 years I have conquered, spilt blood, expanded the empire. Since I became Caesar, I've known 4 years without war, 4 years of peace, and 20. And for what? I brought the sword and nothing more. Maximus says, Caesar, your life, and he interrupts, and Marcus says, please don't. Don't call me that. Didn't want to be called Caesar. He says, come here and sit. Let us talk now. Together. Now. He says now twice there. I thought that was significant when I went back through it. Let us talk now. Together. Now. It's the importance of the moment. He's trying to get Maximus's attention that this is a more important conversation than you realize you walked into. I've got more to tell you than you thought. Very simply, as men, well, Maximus, talk. Maximus says, 5,000 of my men are out there in the freezing mud. 3,000 are cleaved and bloodied. 2,000 will never leave this place. I will not believe they fought and died for nothing. Now, that's the spirit of a man you can get behind. That man understands that war is not just about winning battles. It's about your soldiers. It's about your men. It's about the people. And more importantly than that, it's about what you use those people for. If it means nothing, then you're a horrible person. But if it means something, then it means something. Marcus says, and what would you believe? Maximus says, they fought for you and for Rome. And Marcus says, what is Rome, Maximus? Maximus says, I've seen much of the rest of the world. It is brutal and cruel and dark. Rome is the light. And Marcus says, yet you've never been there. You've not seen what it has become. I am dying, Maximus. When a man sees his end, he wants to know that there has been some purpose to his life. How will the world speak my name in years to come? Will I be known as the philosopher, the warrior, the tyrant? Or will I be remembered as the emperor who gave Rome back to herself? There was a dream that was Rome. You could only whisper it. Anything more than a whisper, and it would vanish. It was so fragile, and I fear that it will not survive the winter. Maximus, let us whisper now together, you and I. You have a son. Maximus nods his head. Tell me about your home. Maximus looks a bit surprised at the invitation to hear about his home, but he pipes up. He gets a little pep in his step. And he begins to talk, and before he knows it, he's just going on and on and on and on because he's ready to go back there. He has a place where he came from, and he's destined to return. My house is in the hills above Trujillo. Very simple place, pink stones that warm in the sun, kitchen garden that smells of herbs in the day and jasmine in the evening. Through the gate is a giant poplar. Figs, apples, pears. Excuse me. The soil, Marcus, it's black like my wife's hair. Grapes on the south slopes, olives on the north. Wild ponies play near my house. They tease my son. He wants to be one of them. Marcus says, Maximus, when was the last time you were home? Maximus says, 2 years, 264 days, and this morning. Marcus says, I envy you, Maximus. It's a good home. Worth fighting for? Maximus nods, yes. Marcus rises. There's one more duty that I ask. before you go home. Maximus quickly rises. He's a soldier. He's been called to attention. Respectfully, what will you have me do, Caesar? Marcus says, I want you to become the protector of Rome after I die. I will empower you to one end alone, to give power back to the people of Rome and end the corruption that has crippled it. Shock, bewilderment comes over Maximus. He's trying to juggle all of his feelings at the moment. Marcus continues and says, will you accept this great honor that I've offered you? And as a child or a young man, this is what I related to the most. Now I relate to more aspects than just this. With all my heart, no. And then Marcus leans in and grabs Maximus' head with both of his hands. He says, Maximus, that's why it must be you. Maximus said, but surely there's a prefect, a senator, somebody who knows the city, who understands politics. And Marcus says, but you've not been corrupted by their politics. Maximus, we just talked about his son. Ask Marcus about his. And what about Commodus? Because he knows how this goes. This is a Caesar with an heir. That goes to the son. It's how it's supposed to be, even though that's not how it's traditionally been. Marcus says, Commodus is not a moral man. You've known that since you were young. Commodus cannot rule. He must not rule. You are the son that I should have had. Commodus will accept my decision. He knows that you command the loyalty of the army. Maximus is speechless. He just says, I need some time, sire. Marcus says, yes, by sunset, I hope you will have agreed. Now embrace me as a son and bring an old man another blanket. Part of the tragedy in Marcus Aurelius' real life is that he and his wife, who was the daughter of Antoninus, who was the emperor at the time that he became co-emperor with, he and his wife lost 7 children before they reached the age of adulthood. Marcus, like I said, named a co-emperor, Lucius Verus, along with Commodus. But the idea was to name one of his sons. None of them survived in real life. So it's a tragic story for Marcus Aurelius in the end of all things, because he truly was in a situation like this movie really proclaims quite adequately and beautifully, is that he knows what options he has available are no good, and he's trying to find an option that will work. In real life, that wasn't available because Maximus didn't exist. So he did pass it to Commodus, and that became part of the issue with the fall of Rome. But in that moment, there was an idea of Rome, and you could only whisper it. Harkens back to this idea that the tree being in the center of the garden, having that focal point, all of these things are pointing inward towards this one inevitable impasse. But it's such a fragile decision to make because the threat, the temptations are so real. You eat or touch it, you die. But if you whisper it, if you hear the whisper of the divine enchantment, you surely won't die. But you'll become what you always were meant to be. Change into something else. See, Adam and Eve were gardeners in a garden. What they were being awoken to was becoming warriors in a garden. The job didn't change. It was always to tend to the garden. Why? The garden is where God grows things. The garden is where the vine is. It's where the grapes are. It's where the press is. It's where we get the new wine from. But in this life, there will be suffering. There will be struggle. There will be evil. There will be difficulty. And the fact that you're aware of that means you have to be competent to confront it and face it. And right now, in the garden, just being awoken, you're not ready. But because you've accepted that fate, because you've made that choice, Now I can make you ready. Now I can give you the armaments you need. Now I can transform you from animals and gardeners to warriors and put you in a garden to protect it and to watch over things as they flourish. Now, I was talking to the bishop earlier, and I'd like to bring him on as kind of a special guest here because he had an input that I thought was great on this idea of warrior in a garden and what that looks like in the weapons of our warfare not being carnal, but being spiritual, being divine. So I'm going to ask him to come up and talk to us a little bit about Gideon piercing with the light. Welcome, my friend.
Welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Wonderful comprehension and understanding in the relatability of God to all people. And that whisper, as he has well stated, very well the whisper of God to continue the inevitable discerning of wisdom, desire of wisdom, which cannot be comprehended without the knowing and the discerning of good and evil. Now, in the book of Judges, we have a man who is threshing out his wheat from his winepress behind a well, hiding from the oppression of the enemy. And this is currently the Midianites. These are the direct descendants of the family that Moses first married into, Jethro and his people. And they are still persecuting God's people. So we see that this Jethro, this Midianite, and now his hordes of people are trying to and continuing to attack Israel after their inheritance in the land of Canaan from the days of Joshua. And God's going to take a man who is trying to do his best, who is thinking upon the Lord. He sends a prophet and begins to state all the miracles and the battles that God has won for his people, and yet they're here again found in one of the 12 cycles that Judges chronicles of the oppression of the enemy and the sinfulness of his nation, their repentance, their restoration, and their return to greatness because of God. This Gideon is chosen by God to become the mighty man of valor that is within him. He is a gardener, but he's truly a warrior. And God calls him a mighty man of valor. Now, that inner soldier, that inner warrior, realizes this as he thinks upon the power of God. The angel of the Lord visits him, begins to announce to this man who seems to be fearing and hiding from the enemy that something inside of him is greater than something outside of him. Now, again, this is the inner whisper. This is the voice. As many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons and daughters of God. Mm-hmm. He is not living up to his God-given potential. So God realizes and wakes up, as he clearly laid out, the spiritual man inside of the carnal, natural body. There's a spirit inside of Gideon that was created to overcome, that was created to win, that was created to have victory, that was created to give liberty, that was created to defeat the enemies. And the angel of the Lord is helping him now recognize his true God consciousness, his true origins by regeneration and awakening the soldier inside of Gideon. Good. So we go from, it's kind of amazing, 32,000 people, and God says, no, that's too many. I don't want to do it that way. God cuts it down to 10,000 people, and then God cuts it down to 300 people. So he sends 22,000 before they ever engage with the Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other people of the east who have enumerated themselves like grasshoppers in a valley. They're already outnumbered if everybody stayed. If everybody, all 32,000 went to war, they're grossly outnumbered, somewhere around 15-1. But God continues to cut down 22,000, 9,700 people down to 300. And in Judges 7 through 17, he is wanting to be sure and wanting affirmation because he is going to do what God told him to do. A lot of people think that he's some coward being pushed into this by God. No, he, like all of us, needs reassurances because he is going to go and risk his life because of what God said. He's going to put himself in the sacrifice of obedience to deliver his nation. So he asked God in Judges 7, by 300 men that lapped the water will I save you, and I will deliver my people again. And he told the men that were with him to take their victuals and to take their trumpets and to take a pitcher, and they were going to go to war without swords. There are no swords in this that Israel has at this time. And they go to the valley of Midian, and it came to pass that night that God tells him, arise, it's time to go. He wakes him up out of sleep, and he gets his servant Phurah, and Phurah means bearing fruit, and they go down to the edges of the camp of the enemy. And a man walks out, and he said, I had a dream. Let me tell my fellow servant this dream. And he said, and the man of Midian said, yes, tell us your dream. And the man who dreamed the dream, he said, it's interesting. He said, something as soft as a barley cake tumbled into our tent. A barley cake. And this is said to be the bread of the gods. Now remember that Jesus came out of the house of bread, and now Gideon is being symbolized by a soft barley cake. And it tumbled into the tent, and he said, it overcame us, it defeated us, it destroyed us, and it laid our tent flat. Now, Gideon and his servant Phurah are in earshot, and they hear the interpretation. And his fellow told him, he said, this is nothing less than the sword of Gideon among us. Now, 300 people. God is already putting fear in the camp of these 3 sections of armies. So, in these 3 sections, they don't know each other. All these different men don't know each other, and that's going to work to Gideon's benefit. Once they hear the interpretation that this is the sword of Gideon, and they've got no swords, that the fear of God is already went before you into the enemy, and they're having dreams about the power of Gideon because he is going to obey God. Now watch this. This is a beautiful statement. As we move on in the chapter, you'll find in verse 15, Gideon, after he heard the telling of the dream and the interpretation, he worshiped. And the God that told him to arise out of his sleep, he now speaks to the 300 and says, it's time to arise. God is going to give us a victory. And then he said something that I love in 7:17 in the book of Judges. He said, I want you all, when I take my pitcher and when I blow my trumpet, all of you do as I do. Even as Paul said that you can follow me as I follow Christ in 1 Corinthians 11:1. In other words, he said, I want you all to do exactly what I'm doing. And they broke themselves up in 3 bands of 100 apiece and trapped them against the valley wall. So they had 3 sides that they were going to go in, 100 men each. And he said, when I blow the trumpet, I want you to take the pitcher that's in your left hand that has a candle in it that's burning. And right now, the light only burns vertically. I want you to knock the side out of it, and I want you to begin to blow your trumpet with your right hand. So the left hand has a pitcher with the light that is going up, but once the sides broke out, it now shines horizontally, which is the sign of the cross. Connection with God will give you victory with your fellow man over all of your enemies. If you have illumination from above, it will give you illumination horizontally to defeat your enemies. So they break out the side, they begin to blow the trumpet. All of these men are soldiers who will ultimately win the victory of being gardeners and keeping an agricultural after this victory. But the soldier in them has to be awakened. So God takes the 300. Gideon begins to blow his trumpet. They all break the sides out of their pitchers, and there's 3 sets of 100 each, and confusion hits the camp of the Amalekites, the Midianites, and all the men of the east. And because all these hordes of men don't know each other, they begin to turn on each other, and they begin to say, this is nothing else but the sword of the Lord and Gideon. This is Gideon that has come upon us. And they literally begin to wipe out each other as they continue to blow their trumpets and shine the light out. And they take 2 of their heads, 2 of the head princes of the Midianites, Orab and Zeb. And Orab means a raven, and Zeb means a wolf. They were literally broken in their power because a man simply believed God, and he was given utensils that you should never be able to win a war with, but when God is in it, when God tells you to do it, it doesn't matter whether or not it makes physical sense or not. Gideon was motivated by God. He was motivated to win this war. He was motivated with his left hand and his right hand. They're walking towards the camp, and they're shouting, the sword of the Lord and Gideon. And the men turn on each other and begin to devour and kill one another. And they went all the way to the mount of Ephraim against the Midianites before the waters unto Bethabara, as is stated in Jordan. And all the men of Ephraim got involved. All the men of Naphtali got involved. All the men of Asher got involved, because once you begin winning a victory, it has its own inertia. It has the snowball effect of more and more people taking on the spirit of faith that you're representing, that you're talking about in all these different stories and all these different movies and these archetypes that are so motivating. It wakes up the inner greatness inside of us. See, 1 John 4:4 said, little children, you are of God and have overcome them. Why? Because greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. The soldier in every one of us. Right. The believer in every one of us. The real Son of God that lives inside of this carnal body that God designed for me and gave to me through Kenneth Gray and Irma Lee Kello. But I was a son of God long before I took on my earth suit. According to Psalm 139:16, all of my members were written in fashion, and they were found in this book. If you want to truly know who you are, and you want to come alive and awaken to your true purpose and consciousness and communion, read the words, the logic, and the logos, because these words are spirit and they are life. They will literally illuminate you. Even as Hanukkah was established as the sons of Maccabees recaptured the temple from the Greeks during that time. And the menorah at that time only had enough oil in it to last for 1 day, but it wound up lasting 8 days. And they put a new menorah that now has 9 candles because that one light lights every other candle. Well, I want to tell you something. There's something that shines brighter than Hanukkah in me. And it's the Father of lights, with whom there is no variableness, neither a shadow of turning. When He illuminates, that is just a small symbol and taste that when God recaptures His temple, and that means my life, my body, greater is He that is in me. Call to remembrance the former days in which you were, sounds like preaching.
You may ever put a really playful dog on a leash for a long time and then let it off? This is what it looks like.
Woo!
You just, Gatling gun approach.
Sorry.
No,
Sorry.
I think that's a beautiful way to tie in what we've been talking about. One, we talked about 2 Corinthians 10:4. The weapons of our warfare are not of this material world. So
Right.
Winning the war with a pitcher and a trumpet and words, to me, sounds like light, sound, and logos. It sounds like everything that God starts Genesis with.
Amen.
Let there be light. So let there be light that travels upward, vertically, light that travels forward, horizontally, and let the words of our proclamation that the sword of the Lord is in the hand of the one that God's chosen to deliver us, let that be all we need. Because we're not fighting this as men.
Right.
I think the reason why God breaks the number down so far is a victory achieved by that great of a number can be reasoned and justified as we accomplish that. But you break it down to 300, oh, well, now you have a similar situation that the Greeks in Sparta faced at the Battle of Thermopylae, or the Hot Gates, when Persia was invading them. We're only going to take this 300. If we get our backs up against the wall and we get a right strategy, we'll be able to do some damage. Look at what men were able to do with 300, and then compare that to what God does with Gideon in the 300.
Amen.
It's an all-out victory, where Thermopylae was not a victory. It was a loss. Now, it came at a great cost to the Persians. It did dwindle their numbers a little, but those men stood for a symbolic reason, to show that this, our home, our livelihood, our lives are worth fighting for, and not to come under the reign of a tyrant. Whereas when God gets involved, 300 takes the whole victory from 3 different tribes of people.
Amen.
3 different nations that are descending upon you have to be turned out and turned the other way, and ultimately decimated. That is what 2 Corinthians 10:4 is talking about.
Amen. And there is a follow-up. The only thing that comes close to this is the victory of Jehoshaphat. When the eyes of the Lord were running to and fro through the earth, that He may show Himself strong in the behalf of them whose heart is upright before Him. So that vertical relationship creates the horizontal effect. When the light that illuminates you from above begins to go out from you and touch others. And God told Jehoshaphat, all I want you to do is go out and praise me and give me thanks, for you shall not need to fight in this battle, because the battle is not yours, but the battle is God's. And they went out and they praised God, and the Bible said that God had set up ambushments against the enemy that also attacked from other nations and other people. So other people were taking advantage of the situation, and it turned to a great victory in the days of Jehoshaphat. This is what God does. What seems to be no way, when it becomes impossible, you're standing on the stage with the Almighty. You're about to see what only God can do through you. All He needs you to do is believe and stand and obey. And whatever He gives you in your left hand, in your right hand, and certainly the Logos, the word in your mouth, and the action, all 300, the 3 groups ran towards the host, and they said, oh my God, every man's sword turned on his neighbor, and they began to kill each other. The Amalekites were killing the people from the east, and the people from the east were killing the Midianites. And there was all this cross confusion and killing and murdering, and they won a great victory. And then 3 more of the tribes got involved. And then the raven, that dirty, unclean, but very wise bird, he got killed, and that wolf, that predator that runs in pack, they're 2 head people in Midianite. Both got their heads chopped off, and they were brought to Gideon. Great victory of God. Great victory of God.
Great victory. And with great victory comes great temptation. One of the things that Marcus Aurelius is credited with saying, and I think we'll park it here and pick this back up with you all on Sunday, if that's okay with you all. Don't want to wear y'all out with this information, and I got some more to get through. We'll talk and definitely make sure we circle the wagons and get the rest of this good stuff off the vine here. But he's credited with a quote that says, "Be careful not to be Caesarified. Be careful not to be dyed or stained purple." Meaning that, and you said it earlier, where this man is, the way we're talking about these stories and these issues, it becomes very relatable. In his Meditations, which of course Marcus Aurelius wrote in the philosophical language of the time, which was Greek. He spoke Latin, and these were his Meditations were writings to himself, where he's being introspective. He's looking into the center of himself, the center of where his knowledge of what he can do for good and what he can do for evil is. And he's writing to himself. He'd probably be mortified if he knew we got a copy of it and we're actually talking about it today, to be honest. But when he says that, it's the same thing that's echoed in the movie when he says, when a man sees the end of his days, he wants to know how he's going to be remembered. Will I be remembered as the philosopher? Will I be remembered as a warrior? Or will I be remembered as a tyrant? Marcus Aurelius is probably one of the most unrelatable human beings on the planet. He was Caesar, 20 years, all of this warfare, all of this conquest, all of this expansion of the kingdom, 20 years as an apprentice under the previous emperor, adopted by the emperor before him as a child. He has an unrelatable life until he goes inside himself, until he reaches the center of his being, where his knowledge of his good and evil is really talked about. And when he talks about it, it sounds like us.
Amen.
It's relatable again.
Yes.
It sounds like something we all understand because he's discussing his potential for good and evil, which is what the human beings in the garden were awakened to, what Gideon is getting affirmation from God of, is this, can I really do this great and good thing? Do I really have the potential to do that? I feel like I do, but I just need to, hold my hand. Give me a little assurance and let me know. And then he goes and he does the thing. And even with Maximus, he's been the warrior. He's ready to be a warrior in a garden, and this requires more warfare. This is another great sacrifice. This is another moment where he's now given more power than he's ever had before, but he's also come under Caesar, and he knows it will change you. Power, access to status, control, dominance, it will change you if you're not careful. So when your armaments are given to you, when you have this ability, when, like Gideon, you tap into your divine potential for accomplishing the will of God, and the weapons of your warfare are not carnal, but they're spiritual, to the pulling down of strongholds. They're divine in a way. They're divine power to break down strongholds. We also have to be careful in that context not to be Caesarified.
Well,
not to be dyed
it's so
purple,
good that he brought that up.
and not to be a tyrant.
Because from this victory, the children of Israel and the 12 tribes during Gideon's lifetime repeatedly came to him and asked him to be the king, and he refused, like Maximus, and he refused, telling them that God is our king. Now, unfortunately, his sons, who had a lust for power, did take the temptation. And that gets into another story of the bramble king that caused great consternation and loss in Israel, that Abimelech, the bramble king, tried to be king, and killed 70 of his brothers to strengthen his position, lusting for the power to be a king. That Gideon, who was the warrior, who won the battle, refused that power because he knew that it really belonged to God.
Right. And that's where God shows us that, I understand what Gideon does there, but if that was the push, if that was where God's leading him to, then you have to do something more akin to what Marcus Aurelius did, and you have to become more self-aware. You have to become more conscious of, well, now that I have this power, am I using it properly? Am I doing it rightly? Am I really taking this seriously? Am I being Caesarified? Am I becoming a tyrant? Have I been dyed purple? Has it changed me? And if you see that it has begun to, then you have to begin to unwind that. Or like Marcus Aurelius says, you have to be careful not to allow those things to happen. And it's the same thing that we ended on right before we called up the bishop, is that we're not competent in ourselves to claim anything comes from us. So there's no reason to dye me purple. There's no reason to call me Caesar. But I can be a king because God has given me the potential to be a king. And in being a king, I know where my competence to be king comes from. And it comes from God. And as so long as you keep that in the context of the conversation, the form and the context is the same. It lays it out that way. Then you are being prepared to get where we're going to go to Sunday. So I'm going to leave you on that cliffhanger. Because that's the preparation for what's to come. Please tune in with us again. Subscribe on YouTube, Facebook, on any platform that gets us. We're on Subsplash now. Please download the app. If you want to give, it's an opportunity to give, and we will receive any offerings or blessings you have for us. Come alive in the comment stream. Make friends. Try not to make enemies, but have a debate, have a conversation. There are different things that we all believe, and when we come to the table and we talk about them, then we can find where God is amongst all of it. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your time. Bishop, thank you for joining me tonight and adding that great biblical story and history behind that battle to demonstrate that our purpose is to be a warrior tending a garden,
Amen.
Not a gardener engaged in war.
Amen.
I love him.
I love him.
Because he first
loved us.
Thank you, and God bless you. We'll see you on Sunday.